Now let's talk about insecure direct object reference, also known as IDOR, and one of the most popular vulnerability types found in bug bounties. An IDOR is when an application provides direct access to an object that doesn't belong to that user. So this will allow a malicious attacker to access data that doesn't belong to them. And that data could be anywhere from PIIs, invoices, receipts, and so on. An IDOR isn't just limited to retrieving data, but it could also allow you to modify or delete them as well. As you can see on the screen, example.com API/user is fetching an object with 167,865 as its ID, and that ID has an address. So that's the user ID, and we're pulling the address for that user specifically. And as we hit that as a user, let's say this is me, Nahamsek, it's going to return the ID, the username, and my address. Now let's say we change that ID. We go from 167,865 to 1, and that's going to return the response with the user ID 1 and the username being set to admin with their address. This is very common. That happens a lot. It's not always just in an API. It could be anywhere with a numerical ID or anything that you can understand how the ID is being calculated, whether it's a base 64 or some sort of another encryption where you can break and create another one. In this example, we can see that we're making a put request to another API endpoint. This one is API user profile. There is no ID in the actual address bar, but in the request that we're sending, the data that's being sent to the server, we're providing an ID, a username, and an email. So now let's say we want to overwrite the user ID 1, which is probably the admin, or another user. We'll just swap out the ID, change the username to Nahamsek1 instead of Nahamsek because we don't want to have the same exact username for both IDs. It's probably not going to let us do that. And we also want to give it another email address. This way we can do a password reset or whatever else we're doing. And the response in some cases may come back as success, it may come back as a 1. We don't know what that response is going to look like, but for this example, the API comes back and says success is true. So now that we understand the basics of an IDOR, we need to look at a few different things. When it comes down to looking for these vulnerability types, a deep understanding of the application is very, very valuable. How does the application fetch data? How does it create new data? Or how does it modify or delete them? Looking for any numerical ID, anything with an integer is a very good indication of an area to test for. The best way to do this is by creating two different accounts, looking at both user IDs, looking at the object ID, whatever we're testing for, in two different browsers, and replacing them back and forth. So you can make a user that's supposed to be your target, and then you make another user that is the attacker. You grab both of those user IDs, those objects you want to fetch, and you go back and forth until you find a vulnerable endpoint. This will help you avoid fetching any data that doesn't belong to you, and most companies would appreciate it. Sometimes the application may use some sort of an encryption in order to hide the user ID, so it's not easily guessable. This could be a base 64 or something more complicated. But at the end of the day, there's always ways around it, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. You can also automate this using Burp. There are a ton of good add-ons and extensions you can install on Burp that automates it, but I personally like to do these manually because it helps me understand the application and it makes sure that I'm not missing any endpoints or I'm not messing it up in any way. In the previous slide, I explained how a company or an application may use some sort of a complex user ID, and I said there may be some ways around it. Outside of just creating two different user IDs and having two different accounts that you're attacking each other with, you can also look for indicators that may leak the other user's unique ID. So in this example, as you can see, the string is a very random string that I put on the screen, but with things like a profile picture or going to the user's profile, clicking on report user, and things like that that allows you to interact with the user's account may help you identify their unique user ID and help you exploit whatever IDOR you have found further.